Hello and welcome to the UN General Assembly.
Welcome to Al Jazeera.
7 billion people.
193 nations.
$26 billion needed to solve the suffering. That's our world.
70 years after the UN was created, the next Secretary General needs to confront crisis out there,
while leading reform in here. Tonight, in the first ever live televised debate, we'll hear from diplomats and the global community affected by their decisions.
And we'll hear from the men and women who believe they're ready to take over from Ban Ki-moon. 12
candidates are vying for the post of UN Secretary General. 10 of them are with us here today on Al Jazeera.
Let's get things started, and the way we're going to start this is hearing from each of the candidates about themselves and why they want to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. Candidates, you're going to get 90 seconds for this answer to make your pitch, to set out your stall. Let's start with Vesna Pusic, Croatia's Deputy Speaker of Parliament. She's also the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, and thank you, General Assembly. Thank you, President of the General Assembly, for giving us this opportunity. It's really a first, as you know. And why do I want to do this difficult, complicated job in difficult, complicated times? I've done many things in my life. I've taught, I've been a teacher, I've been a civil society activist, I've been a parliamentarian, I've been a minister. But throughout my life, the topic of peace, development, and human rights have been absolutely center stage for me. And whatever I did, I focused on these topics, from looking at my neighborhood to looking at the world. So in that sense, it comes very natural to me to think of the organization that actually has made these three topics the center of its activity and interest. But the other thing that motivated me is a deep resentment or antipathy towards cynicism. And there has been a lot, and there is a lot of cynicism in current international relations, national politics, international politics, a lot of sort of playing to the gallery without being prepared to look at the issues. And I want to actually counter that cynicism. This is what I will try.
Thank you very much. Next, Antonio Guterres, High Commissioner for Refugees from 2005 until last year, 2015. He was also Portugal's Prime Minister.
Well, I'm a candidate because this is the place where I believe I can better help to reduce human suffering and offer better opportunities for people. We live in a dangerous world. We see a multiplication of new conflicts. Old conflicts never die, and conflicts are becoming more and more interrelated and interconnected with the global threat of terrorism. At the same time, climate change and population growth are combining to make the world smaller and resources scarcer. And we see people, common people, more and more divorced in relation to national political establishments, but also international organizations. See, for instance, the EU and even the UN in certain aspects. So I believe that we badly need at this moment two things: leadership and values. Now, in a complex world, we need a multiplicity of leaders able to fully assume their responsibilities. The Secretary General is just one of them. But she or he must be a solid ethical reference and must be the symbol of those truly universal values that are enshrined in the UN Charter and that all religions respect in the world. The values that our societies, that are all becoming multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multicultural, need in order to foster inclusion, cohesion, to make people feel they belong, to value diversity, and to confront and defeat political populism, xenophobia, racism, and violent extremism. And I believe those values are the values I've served in all my life.
Thank you. Susana Malcorra is Argentina's Minister of Foreign Affairs. She was also Chef de Cabinet for Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. That, for those that don't know, is effectively the Chief of Staff.
Thank you and good evening to everybody. You know, I came to the United Nations 12 years ago without fully grasping what the United Nations means to the world. And I realized then that in today's complex landscape, the needs and demands of communities and peoples go far beyond their frontiers. So that means that the world demands today a United Nations that is closer to the people, much closer, that puts people and planet up front, and that is driven by the reality of issues and the need to deliver results, a results-driven organization. In my view, to rise to meet the world's expectations, this United Nations requires a Secretary General with the courage to lead, the humility to listen, and the readiness to partner. And I think I am that person. Having been so close to the decision making, I think I fully understand what is needed to take the United Nations to the next level. In the private sector for 25 years, I learned the pressures of delivering results for the shareholders. Let me tell you, nothing is equivalent to the pressure that you feel in this organization when you know that you are saving lives. I am here for that United Nations that we all need and we all want, and I hope to get your trust.
Thank you. Vuk Jeremic served as the president of the 67th session of the United Nations General Assembly. He was also the foreign minister of Serbia.
Well, thank you very much, this is a great privilege. First and foremost, thank you, Mr. President, for according us this privilege. Ladies and gentlemen, we do live in an era of profound transformation that is unprecedented in scale and scope. And most of the challenges that are facing humanity in the 21st century are essentially global in nature. There's only one organization that we are going to have in our lifetime where we can hope to come together and address them decisively, and this is the United Nations. Now, not all is well at the United Nations, I'm afraid. There's a growing perception that some historic achievements made by this organization are becoming more and more overshadowed by the sense of stagnation and failure. Now, we've got to do something about it, and we've got to do it fast. I believe this is not a time for high rhetoric. I believe this is time for decisive action. And to that end, I decided to put forward a detailed public policy platform, which I made publicly available for those of you who do not know. It contains 53 concrete commitments that I am prepared to carry out from day one in the fields of sustainable development, climate change, conflict prevention and peace operations, human rights and humanitarian relief, and the organizational reform itself. I believe we need to change. I believe we need to have a clear plan on how to do it. I believe I have a plan on how to do it, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much indeed. Natalia Gurman is the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Moldova. She was also Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure and honor to be here. And I am a candidate for the position of the Secretary General of the United Nations because I do believe in the commitment of humanity for collective action for the better life of everybody. And I'm absolutely convinced that the United Nations is the preeminent international organization which we can use to deliver on this commitment. And I also trust the power of dialogue and the power of persuasion. As Foreign Minister of the Republic of Moldova, I had only diplomacy and dialogue to help establish a place for my country in the system of international affairs. And I also bring the first-hand experience of identifying the common ground, even amidst geopolitical tensions, where others might see only differences that serve nobody. And even if I am aware that very often a Secretary General should manage disunity, I think we should all strive for finding common ground and finding unity. And we need this unity whether we are to stop wars and conflicts, tackle the scourge of international terrorism, work on international development, or ensure the highest standards of dignity. This experience I am bringing to the service of the organization and to the service of humanity. Thank you.
Now that we've heard why you want to be UN Secretary General and your vision of the United Nations for 2017 and beyond, we want to get to know you more as a person now. So we'll go to our first question of the evening, which is from the Hungarian ambassador to the United Nations, Katalin Borzsói. Thank you so much. Your question to the candidates.
Nice to see you. My question is, what kind of leadership is needed today? What do you think what the UN needs today and what the world needs today as a leader here in the United Nations? And if elected, how would you like to translate what we do here in the UN to the outside world? In the world of communication, how would you really make understandable the importance of our work?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your question. A very interesting and important question, which we'll put to Ms. Vesna Pusic first. A question about leadership style first. I imagine it's a question that you've been asked many times, a bit of a cliche question. Do you see yourself more as a secretary or a general?
Yeah, I heard that one very many times, and I think everybody is a combination of both. But the specific question, what kind of leadership? And I think this is a very important question, because what happened over the past 20 years, I think that the criteria have actually been lowered, and that the sort of fast track for populist has created an atmosphere in which catchy phrases and lack of responsibility is the name of the game. You have to be popular. You have to say things that will sort of catch people's attention or scare them. I don't think that's the leadership we need. I think the leadership we need is deep conviction, vision, perseverance, and courage. And sometimes courage to be even in the minority of one. Because sometimes when you're in the minority of one, over time, if you know that you're going in the right direction, you'll get support.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response, Ms. Pusic. The same question to you, Natalia German, about your leadership style.
Thank you. On the issue of secretary or general, I made myself very clear at the informal debates in the General Assembly. I'm planning to be the general of the Secretariat and UN system and the secretary of the member states. And this is the leadership that I have in mind, because it does require a change of the mindset. You have to be proactive and not reactive, and you have to be this moral commitment and moral authority to articulate to the citizens of the world the problems and the challenges that otherwise would never be articulated. Either we are speaking about the sustaining peace or working on delivering on sustainable development goals, or preserving the standards for human rights and human dignity all over the world. So from this particular point of view, I do believe that this time we don't have the right to fail. We have to succeed in order for the future generation to be able to continue and hopefully live a better life.
Thank you. Next question for Antonio Guterres. How are you going to communicate the message of the United Nations, and how perhaps are you going to use the new forms of communication? For example, social media, which maybe allows you to communicate beyond the halls of the UN directly with the people.
First of all, communication is absolutely crucial. And a serious problem we have in the UN, like other international organizations, is that there is a kind of a cipher language that nobody understands except those that live in the organization. So what we need is to translate the many important initiatives the UN has, the many important things the UN does for the world, into a language that everybody understands. And this, to be honest, is what I've done all my life, especially as a political leader in my own party and in my own government. We need to speak clearly, we need to make people understand, we need to speak with the language that everybody uses. But leadership is not only communication. Leadership is essentially substance. You can never win a battle by communication if the substance of that communication is not embedded in the values that are necessary in today's world.
I'd like to perhaps see if you have a different perspective, because I know your country quite well, and if you go back not that far back in history, I was reporting from your country. It was bombed for 99 days by NATO. I know that wasn't authorized by the UN. At one stage, your country under Milosevic was the pariah country. Does that give you a different perspective on the international community and the way it works?
Well, basically, when I was a young man, I witnessed the consequences of the catastrophic failure in diplomacy and a surge in poverty and absence of the rule of law. So I witnessed it firsthand, and as a young man I did fight for democracy and for human rights myself. I worked hard so that Serbia together is a democracy. But today here I am speaking for the wider audience and about the wider questions that relate to what kind of leadership we need in the United Nations. I believe we do need an action-oriented leadership, people with concrete plans. I think that having served in the UN, having been elected to preside over this chamber a few years ago, I've heard too many UN speeches. And I think this is not a time for high rhetoric, but action and concrete goals. And I think that in order to be able to inspire again humanity in the way that this organization was inspiring it in the last century, we need to make it more transparent and more accessible to the peoples of the world.
Thank you very much for that answer. We are going to move on to our next section of questions, which is about conflict and crisis. And there is so much to talk about here when you look at the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya. We'll come to some of those in a moment, but I think we should start with the situation that's in the news right now, the appalling things we've seen in the last 5 days in South Sudan. Susanna Malcorra, bloodbath on the streets, over 300 people dead, and yet there's UN peacekeepers there, plenty of UN peacekeepers. They're locked down in their bases. Should they be locked down in their bases, or should they be doing what they're mandated to do, protect people? What's your view?
Well, first of all, it's deeply disturbing what is happening in South Sudan. That nation was brought to life through the fight of their people, but also with the full support of the international community and the United Nations. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And what you see there is a total lack of leadership to take the nation forward. I mean, the infighting between the different leaders is the reason for this. It's the notion of not having a view for the future of their people. I think it's clear that the mission in South Sudan has a mandate to protect people. It's not mandated to fight or to see how to stop the fighting between these two parties within the party. But it's also true that there is a need for a solution to that.
Next question to Vesna Prusic. The UN went there to try and nurture the world's newest country. What went wrong? How much of the blame is on the local political players? Is there any blame on the United Nations in your view?
I guess there is sufficient blame to go around, actually. Something that I think, happened, and not only in South Sudan, but I think we've seen it in many places around the world, that there was no sufficient understanding of the nature of that society and the nature of that country. I remember that many years ago, when the situation in Iraq was discussed, there were some people who weren't actually aware that there were Shia and Sunni in Iraq. And to some extent, this is also the situation in South Sudan. It is a divided society. It always was a divided society, and it was approached to some extent as a society that when they see institutions of democracy, they will all fall into place. This is not the case. You need much more, not only soldiers on the ground, but actually, activists, politicians, people with hands-on being present in a country like that.
Now, we're coming very much to the end, and because we're running out of time, I do want to give you all a last word, and we'll start with Vesna Pusic. Your final thoughts.
I will not make my final statement now. I will answer the question you have not asked me, but I wish you had. So I will answer the question about women in positions, in public positions. And first, I happen to be a woman. I don't think this is enough. I happen to be a feminist, and I think this is important. And it's important not because female experience of life is more important than male experience of life. But the UN was dominated for 70 years with 50% of experience of what life is.
Thank
you.
I
think we need to add the other 50%.
Antonio Guterres.
Now, just to say that I had the enormous privilege to serve in the UN for more than 10 years as High Commissioner for Refugees. You can't imagine what it is to be able to devote myself to the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. But you can't imagine the terrible frustration it is to see people suffering and not to have a solution for them. And this was the reason why I believe I had the obligation to present myself as a candidate to Secretary General.
Susanna Malcorra.
This is a time where we need to inspire. The United Nations needs to inspire its own people, its own staff, and it needs to inspire the world, the people outside. Because we know that without the United Nations, we have no option, we have no alternative. So I think we need a leader that can have that inspiration, that at the same time has the humbleness to listen, and has the obsession to deliver. I think I can do that, and having been at the center of the United Nations and the power making of the United Nations, I am convinced that I bring value added to.
Vukjanovic.
Well, I'm afraid that we are not so lucky to be living in easy times, and that some of the challenges and some of the choices that we will have to make are going to be pretty difficult. But I do nonetheless have high hopes, because I do believe in humans' resilience, and I do believe in the United Nations. But if you think that we need here in this organization business as usual, and if you want more of the same old things, more of the same old faces, then I'm clearly not your candidate. But if you do share my hope of a rejuvenated, reinvigorated, agile, and transparent United Nations, then I ask you to support me so that we can try and together build an institution that we will feel proud to endow.
Natalia Gurman, please.
If I'm the next Secretary General of the United Nations, I would never cease to articulate that whatever we do in this organization, we have one major ally and partner, and this is the people. And if we manage to bring back relevance of the United Nations to the people of the world, win their hearts and minds, we have actually created this very strong and stable partnership, which translates into ownership. And if all of us feel ownership in the objectives of the United Nations, then this will be the recipe for success.
And that's where we end the first round. The first 5 candidates, we've been giving them some tough questions.
Yes.
We had some interesting but eloquent answers.
And coming up next, in not too long, we'll have 5 more candidates to the post of UN Secretary General who will be joining us, asking the same questions. Some of them will be different, but most of them will be the same. Thank you so very much for participating in this debate. Welcome back to the UN General Assembly. We are witnessing an historic event on Al Jazeera today, the first ever live televised debate of the candidates to the post of UN Secretary General. 12 candidates in total are vying for the post to replace Ban Ki-moon in January of 2017. We have 10 of them with us on Al Jazeera. We've already heard from 5 of them who've given us their vision of the United Nations and what it should be. Now we have our next panel of 5.
Here we go again, and it's the same format as last time, but those who perhaps didn't catch the beginning of the last programme, we're going to hear from each of the candidates about their background and why they want this job, this poison chalice of being the Secretary General of the United Nations. So let's go one by one. They have 90 seconds each to set out their stall. Helen Clark, Administrator of the UN Development Programme and the former Prime Minister of New Zealand.
It's not a poison challenge. There are many challenges the UN has to step up to, and they run across development, environment, human rights, humanitarian needs, peace and security. I know we've got the groundbreaking agendas for sustainable development and climate change, and we have to work to implement them as fast as we can. But I think where the UN is seen to be falling short is in the peace and security area. We have to get better at preventing conflict and resolving conflict. I believe the long-term answers lie in building the peaceful and inclusive societies which will talk their differences out and not fight them out. But in the short term, we have to get a lot better at anticipating those warning signs of what could spill over into serious human rights abuses and conflict. As Secretary General, in stepping up to these challenges, I would draw on my long experience of leadership and of having to make a lot of hard calls. And I do think I have the vision, the experience and the skills to lead this great organisation founded in 1945 to have a better, fairer, safer world for all its people. Thank you.
Next, Danilo Turk, former President of the Republic of Slovenia and the UN Assistant Secretary General, former for Political Affairs.
The world today needs a renovated United Nations. But in order to renovate the United Nations, we need experience, we need commitment, and we need vision. And I believe that in my 30 years of work with the United Nations, I have gained a great deal of experience in human rights, in dealing with political issues in the General Assembly and Security Council, and later as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. The interesting thing is that in all this time, my commitment to the United Nations has only grown stronger. Today, before this meeting, I met one of my friends from the indigenous community, and we talked about the times when the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples was formulated in the United Nations, and we very quickly realized what kind of action is needed today. So this is an example which shows how commitment comes from experience and how current tasks can be identified with clarity. And of course, that requires development of partnerships. UN cannot be only a club of governments. It has to have partners in the non-governmental community, in civil society generally, in academia and the business community. And I believe that tonight we'll be able to talk about this in some detail. Thank you.
Christiana Figueres headed the UN's top climate change body, and she led more than 100 countries to a global climate deal in Paris last year.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming here tonight. My vision is that of a community of nations coming together to work in a deeply collaborative manner to address the toughest problems of our planet. I know that this is difficult. I know it's difficult because I have done it. 6 years ago, I inherited a collapsed negotiation with a total deadlock in the process and with total absence of trust among all parties involved. 6 days ago, I left that process on the back of the most ambitious agreement that is unanimous, that is legally binding, and that points a clear path forward for all nations and all other stakeholders to address the issue of climate change. That was possible because with patience and determination, we collectively built a process that fully respected national interests, national needs, and national ambitions, but that was at the same time capable of identifying the common ground. That is multilateralism at its best, and that is what we need in all other areas of the United Nations, in particular in peace and security, that is at the heart of the UN. I have delivered a multilateral breakthrough. I believe that with clear leadership, together, we can and we must continue to deliver multilateral breakthroughs time after time after time.
Igor Lukšić is the former Prime Minister of Montenegro. He was until recently also his country's foreign minister.
Good evening, first of all, to all, and I have to say it's a great pleasure to be here tonight and take part in such a distinguished panel on such an important topic. First time so public, first time so open and transparent. It's been also a great pleasure to take part in the whole of the process up to now, and rightly so. Today, we're in the process that selects 1 for 7 billion, as one of the NGOs has nicely put it. But 70 years ago, it was 1 for 2 billion. And when UN turns 150, it will be 1 for 11 billion. So world changes, will continue to change. We have to be ready to face the change. We have to be ready and able to respond to all the challenges we're going to face. I come from a country which 20 years ago was in the region that was engulfed in war. We had mass massacres. We had a number of different other problems. But we've managed to come out of the crisis. We've managed to sustain peace. We have always been investing a lot in multi-religiousness, multiculturality of my country. And I believe we have developed also certain transitional experience that can show to the world certain examples that can be actually what the world today needs. Talking about the challenges that UN faces, we quite often point to the need that we have to respect some of the major principles, like 50% gender parity, rightly so. But what I also like to emphasize is another 50% of the world's population, that they are under 25. We have to work, we have to prepare UN, we have to work for them, because that's the generation to come, and we have to prepare well for them.
Thank you. Irina Bokova is the Director General of UNESCO, and she served as an acting foreign minister for Bulgaria.
First, James, thank you for this opportunity to Al Jazeera and, of course, to the President of the General Assembly. There are two reasons which gave me the audacity and the courage to be a candidate for this important position. The first, of course, is the great privilege of serving an organization like UNESCO for the last 7 years, which has a wide-range mandate, and I would say a beautiful mandate, the soft power of the United Nations, to promote education, to promote culture, intercultural dialogue, to protect world's heritage, to give all the power of the sciences, of new technologies, to give also and work for the promotion of the freedom of expression, of freedom of speech, to protect journalists. And I believe nowadays the challenges that are in front of us with the conflict, with the humanitarian situations, with the climate change, ask for more United Nations, ask for more engagement, for more of the soft power of the United Nations. And the second reason is I'm a deep believer in multilateralism, coming from a country that is multicultural, a bridge between the East and the West.
And now let's get into a very important issue, and that is crisis and conflict. As we mentioned, the world we live in today is experiencing crisis like never before. There is the war in Syria, there is Iraq, of course, and those wars with the refugee crisis they've created as well. Now, we want to talk about how, as Secretary General, you would solve these crises. We will go first to a question from our audience here, and this is Christian Thibault, who is a Brazilian student who's just joined us from Brazil, especially for this event. So if you could please give him a round of applause. He's very excited to be here. Now, Christian is going to be speaking in Portuguese, and then I will tell you what he says after he asks his question. Christian.
O fato do Conselho de Segurança ser composto por apenas 5 países como membros permanentes gera desequilíbrio entre as nações, tendo em vista o poder de veto que tais países possuem. Quais as medidas que poderiam ser tomadas para tornar este Conselho de Segurança mais justo e igualitário?
Thank you very much, Christian. This question is... Thank you. Well done, thank you. The question is about Security Council reform, of course. The fact, he says, that the UN Security Council is composed of only 5 permanent members, given their veto power, generates a power imbalance between nations. What measures could be undertaken, he says, to make sure the Security Council is more just and egalitarian? Let's put that question perhaps to Mr. or a lady. Let's try Ms. Helen Clark.
Well, 2 issues there. One is about the composition of the Security Council, and the other is about the decision-making in the Security Council. On the composition, we have a council which reflects 1945, the end of World War II settlement. 10 years ago, the member states had a good go at trying to reform it. It didn't get to conclusions. The debate is raging again. If there's anything I can do as Secretary General to facilitate that debate, have the organisation offer technical options, legal advice, I will do that. Secondly, on the decision making, I would like to think I could contribute to building a better culture of trust between key parties on the Council, because the Security Council works best when there isn't polarisation on it, when everybody is seized of the importance of solving a threat to peace and security.
Let me try with another example, Irina Bokova, a conflict that goes back till the very early days before the origins, in fact, of the conflict before the UN was founded, and that's the situation with Israel-Palestine. Again, quite hard to get action in the Security Council. The last time they tried a resolution, it was blocked. It wasn't voted on by a majority of the Council, and one of the veto members, one of the P5, actually voted against it. There hasn't actually been a resolution in the Security Council on this issue since the end of the Gaza war in 2009, and we've had 2 Gaza wars since.
In order to implement the resolutions, adopted resolutions by the Security Council, and what is also the will of the General Assembly and the United Nations to have a 2-state solution, and two states living in peace, to have the security for both states, we need to build trust. What I see now these last years is lack of trust, lack of political process, lack of trust, practically no negotiations, no contacts, and I think the first of the responsibilities of a future Secretary General will be to start rebuilding trust between the negotiating parties. I think this is extremely important. If we don't have trust, I think this will continue to be one of those protracted crises.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bokova, for that response. Now, Mr. Danilo Turk, I want to ask you not about how you would break the deadlock in the Security Council on Syria or the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but specifically a message to the people affected by these conflicts. On Syria, for instance, according to the most conservative estimates, 250,000 people have died in Syria. 4.6 million people are displaced, are refugees. The Syrian voices that we hear on Al Jazeera say they feel let down by the international community. They feel abandoned by the United Nations. As Secretary General, what would be your message to those people? What hope can you offer them?
This, of course, is a very difficult question, because UN has lost much of its credibility in Syria. I would like to remind ourselves that former Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was the first joint envoy for United Nations and the Arab League, came with a plan 4 years ago, and that plan was not accepted. And later, many years later, the same ideas came to the fore. Now, UN has lost a lot of credibility in that regard. Now, I think that the way to regain credibility requires several steps. First, there has to be more humanitarian assistance to deal with the immediate needs. There were some improvements recently, but much more needs to be done. Secondly, the Secretary General has to work with Staffan de Mistura and the Security Council to come to specific proposals before September this year. Now, of course, this relates to the current Secretary General. And the next Secretary General will have to take from there. And if we work together, then possibly we can regain the necessary trust which was so sadly lost.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to take another question now from the floor, and this is a representative from the Liechtenstein mission to the United Nations, Jorn Oliver Ehrman. Your question.
Thanks. The United Nations has been undermined by several instances of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, including of minors. How do you think the UN should best address this issue?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer this, because I have a track record of zero tolerance of sexual abuse in the institution in which I had the honor to lead. And it is that zero tolerance that would guide me, not from day one, but from day zero. And it is the one that we should all actually ascribe to. Immunity cannot be impunity. All those who have been proven or would be proven after a very serious and robust investigation to be guilty of sexual abuse must be held to account. This is the only way to reestablish the integrity of our very, very hard-working and very courageous peacekeeping forces.
Thank you very much. Ms. Helen Clark, of course, everyone condemns these abuses. Everyone, has strong words against them. But what do we do to prevent them from happening in the first place?
First thing is to make sure that all troops being dispatched to wear the blue helmet are fully trained and aware of the consequences of committing these horrific acts against the populations they're supposed to be protecting, not preying on. Secondly, any whisper of abuse should be reported, and when reported, promptly taken up. That should mean those troops or trooper being suspended, probably sent home, and then the country's judicial system is expected to prosecute, and if someone is found guilty, to be punished accordingly.
Ms. Figueres, one of the consequences of this widening gap between the rich and poor has been the mass migration of people from Africa into Europe, from the Middle East into Europe, the refugee crisis, but also the migrants crisis. I wonder, as Secretary General, how would you change the system to make the United Nations deal better with this crisis that we're experiencing, an unprecedented crisis, the worst refugee crisis since the end of the Second World War?
That is absolutely correct. Today we have 65 million migrants either displaced either inside the country or outside, the largest number that we have ever had, and putting an enormous strain on all our humanitarian aid organizations, including the United Nations. So one way to look at this is to first start with human rights and ensure that all of those who are being forced to migrate away are being treated with dignity and in full respect of their human rights. Secondly, we have to have a system that actually shares better global responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of the countries that are right there. There's global responsibility to be shared. And thirdly, we have to look at the root causes of this migration and work in a preventive way to not let migration duplicate or triplicate, which it would do unless we pay that attention.
Mr. Danilo Turk, on that same issue of migration and the refugee crisis, how would you as Secretary General make sure that the most vulnerable people who flee war and conflict, poverty in their countries, are treated in a good manner in the host countries that they are, that the host countries who receive these people adhere to the responsibilities, their responsibilities under international law?
International law has to be implemented, and the commitment to international law on refugee issues and on other relevant issues is central to the policy that the UN has to lead. Now, of course, there have to be practical measures to implement the international legal standards. And one of the aspects which I think have been largely neglected in the discussions on refugees and migration was how to ensure that people who find themselves in these situations also can work. There has to be something done for better employment opportunities in the countries of asylum, and there has to be a mobilization of international resources and will to go in that direction.
Obviously, the Syria crisis is swelling the numbers, but we're seeing so many people moving around from country to country. This is something we're going to have to get used to forever now, aren't we?
Well, I hope not forever, but
people want to move.
Absolutely, and it's not. I mean, 65 million people are on the move, but there is a lot more people who want to resettle. And just imagine all of them. I think it's some research shows it's about 200 million people they want from economic reasons to resettle somewhere else. Technically, it may lead to the increase of GDP, world GDP, in the short run. In the long run, it would bring devastating polarization of income, as many skillful people would leave those developing countries. So that's a very important aspect we need to take into account, and that's why Sustainable Development Agenda also recognizes migration issues. But let me also turn and comment on more immediate problem of migration, which, I mean, my country was not on that route, but we were in the neighborhood of the Western Balkans route, and we've been seeing that. 17 years ago, in my country, there was 20% of the population who were refugees or internally displaced people. So I really understand problems Jordan, Lebanon, other countries are facing today. And compared to that, I mean, European problem is really minuscule. So we need to make sure that refugees, if they want to resettle, and it's very difficult to return, the repatriation is at the lowest level compared to what we had in 80s. So the only way forward is probably through a combination of humanitarian and development aid. We need to focus on development. When asked about my concerns related to the current world, it's the lack of development. We must not let it happen.
I'd like to ask you now a specific question about a country that is one of the poorest in the world and certainly one of the poorest in the Americas. A question about Haiti, because the UN's involvement in Haiti is one that some have found very controversial. Clearly, there has been this outbreak of cholera. Now, the official figures say 9,200 people have died from cholera in Haiti. Many believe the figures are much higher than that. Most scientists you talk to believe that the UN peacekeepers brought cholera to Haiti. So maybe we can have a show of hands. As Secretary General, would any of you admit responsibility and apologise to the people of Haiti? Who would do that? if you can perhaps explain why, please. Explain why for me, and then we'll speak to the others.
Because I believe that the integrity of the United Nations also on that has actually been tarnished. That was an unintended consequence of a very important goal of the United Nations, unintended consequence. But we have to be responsible even for unintended consequences. If I go to the 38th floor, I will make sure that during my tenure, we completely eradicate malaria and cholera from Haiti through, and the advantage of that is that we will actually increase the sanitation level and the health levels overall. But that is a responsibility, a moral responsibility that the United Nations has and that must be fulfilled.
What I learned as a Prime Minister was no matter how tempting it might be to comment on a case before the courts, it's not wise to do so. We have a case on this before the courts in this country. What I know is that people have died, as you said, children are orphaned, people have lost loved ones because of this. Has the international response to that situation been sufficient? No. Cholera is still in Haiti. So the critical thing now is to rally support for Haiti to have better water and sanitation for its people, better living conditions, and for the families who have been so damaged by what has happened to be able to rebuild their lives. If there are issues of sanitation in UN camps, which there may well be, let us attend to that, because UN peacekeepers shouldn't be living in squalor either, if that is going to cause a problem, as it will, not only to them, but to a surrounding neighbourhood.
Thank you so much to all of our candidates, the 5 that are here now and the 5 that were here before. So 10 of the candidates. Remember, there are actually 12 candidates in this race for the job of UN Secretary General. Probably worth explaining to the audience at home what happens next. It's not a vote of these people. It's a vote of a very different body. The UN Security Council gets the final vote. What's happening in the next week, just over a week, is the Security Council is having its first straw poll.
But we do want to hear from our viewers about who you think came out on top today of the 10 candidates who were here, who did well, who you think should be the next UN Secretary General. Join us on social media using the hashtag NextSG. That's it for this historic event. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.